Before we get started with today's episode, I want to tell you a little bit about our guest, Myke Nahorniak, who is hailing over from just north of San Francisco and has a very interesting story to tell. He's the co-founder and CEO of Localist, and Localist has actually been around the block quite a bit already. So it's not a brand new startup. So we see quite some learnings that we can be tapping into today in today's episode. And essentially, Localist is a community event platform. Very simply, I mean, what communities are there for? To bring people together. And today we're going to be learning how the platform is leveraged, how he's thinking about growth, and a little bit about Myke's journey as well. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Very cool. So, I mean, you're probably, the best to give us a 360 overview of what Localist is all about. Maybe tell us, like, what is it and who is it for?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we are community event software. We're built for organizations who are trying to grow their communities through events. And so as a product, we essentially are combining event management software with marketing automation tools to ultimately deliver an event marketing automation platform. So another way to think about it is we're like HubSpot, but specifically designed for event content. And I'm sure you're going to be asking, well, how is that different than Eventbrite? And the two biggest differences are one, when you think about a platform like Eventbrite, it's really designed for one kind of event, which is an event that needs registration. And what we found is across our entire network, events that are happening in communities, only 5% of them need registration. And so there isn't really any other software for the other 95% of events. And so that's really who we're built for, or what we're built for. It's the other 95% of events that are happening in a community.
What type of events would they be? Maybe you could give us a quick overview. What types of events are typically, run through Localist?
Sure. So it really is about every event. So when you think about, so for example, we work with over 200 universities, and including, I want to say it's now 60 of the top 100 schools in the US. And they have thousands of events every month. And essentially they're like mini cities, right? A college campus. And so you imagine, if you're at school, you're a new freshman and you don't know anybody. You are looking to the school to give you that connection to other people. And so when you think about the best way to create that connection, it's through events. And so, you think about learning events, meetups, ice cream socials on the quad. And then when you get outside of higher ed, right, there are learning webinars, workshops, networking events. With nonprofits, there are fundraisers. With conferences, there are trade shows or sessions within the trade shows. And so the value is really, it isn't about choosing software and kind of thinking about every event in a silo. It's about looking at events as a channel. And when you centrally manage and market all of them, you ultimately get this full picture of what's happening in your community. For example, what we found is the biggest indicator of a strong community member, essentially someone who could turn into an influencer for your brand, or if nothing else, a proponent of your company, is recurring event attendance. And so if you have a different platform for each event that you're having, you're never really going to get that picture without doing a bunch of math later on the back end to figure out, well, who has repeatedly come to events. And so our software is designed to paint that picture for you, to tell you how healthy your community is through events.
Very cool. Makes a whole lot of sense. Who would be bringing the platform into those communities, those colleges? Like, is that a head of operation? Is that a head of marketing? Like, who's actually the person that brings it in?
Yeah, it's definitely the head of marketing. Usually, it's the highest marketing position in the company because events just they permeate every function in a company. So you think about sales. There are different kinds of sales events like happy hours or webinars, information sessions. There are marketing events like conferences. There are HR events like employee events that are happening inside the company or recruiting events. And so when you think about events as a holistic strategy for the entire company, you really need either a head of marketing to own that for the whole company, or in some cases, we actually will see a head of community, which is sort of a new emerging position we're seeing that we're really excited about.
Very cool. What would you say though, especially you have this new role emerging, head of communities, you have obviously the marketeers that you're going after. Like what is a typical journey of somebody getting to know about Localist and, finally getting started? Maybe tell us a little bit about the client acquisition channels. Like how do they get to know you guys?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say it's certainly, it's a challenge in a couple ways. So just to paint the picture of the community software industry, it's a burgeoning industry for sure. In the last 2 years, over 50% of the companies that make up the community software industry were created. So it's like a brand new industry, but it's going off like a rocket. And so what that speaks to is just the biggest challenge is customer education. So our philosophy is that without events, you just don't have a community. But when you think about sort of traditionally defined community software, it's really about ticket deflection. Like, how do we reduce the cost of customer support? Well, we can have the community answer support questions for other customers, so we don't have to. And our view is that community is about connection. Like ultimately, communities are people coming together, united around a purpose. And that's much better served through events rather than through support tickets or forums. But the challenge there is that there's a lot of education that has to happen there. And so what that means is it's much more expensive. It requires a lot of repetition. And it means that when customers first learn about us, they're not necessarily looking for what we offer outside of maybe, basic event marketing / event management. And so a lot of our customer acquisition journey is meeting them where they are and bringing them over to a new way to think about how to solve the problem ultimately.
Gotcha. Would you place yourself in the sort of the more the inbound arena or the outbound arena with different, the listeners are always very interested to see, which type of company maps into which type of strategy?
Yeah, sure. I would say for sure outbound. We're always, I would say we're trying to get the inbound machine going, but well, that's not fair to say. The inbound machine, the machinery is running, and we're absolutely seeing inbound interest. But what I mean by that is outbound is sort of the way to plant the seed, and then that ultimately gets prospects through the funnel. Eventually, those those prospects become customers, and then we work backwards from that and build a marketing strategy. Essentially, build an inbound strategy from that journey. So, because outbound is just much slower, and it's much more manual, obviously, it does take more work, and yeah, it takes more time. But ultimately, that work pays off because once we've gotten to a certain critical mass in a particular industry or a common denominator of a problem we solve, we can then tell that story through marketing and through inbound channels to essentially repeat the process,
Yep.
but much more quickly.
Very cool. You touched a little bit there how outbound and inbound plays together. Maybe tell us just a little word before we're moving on and interview about the website. Like what role do you attribute to the website at the moment?
Definitely customer education. So we are, I would say one challenge, right, is you think about a platform like Localist, it's enterprise software. It has a lot of integrations with other platforms. And that's some of the value of the platform is, if you're going to bring Localist into a company, you would expect it to integrate with all of your other platforms so you can make better decisions about your overall marketing strategy or company strategy, community strategy, et cetera. But the challenge with that is that it's also with sophistication comes challenges around making it simple again, where it's like, hey, how do you make this an easy button for your community? And so, a platform that I'm sure everyone knows about, Salesforce. Imagine trying to sell or market Salesforce in one sentence to every company on the planet. It's very difficult to condense it down into one sentence beyond, well, it's a CRM platform. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Well, it depends on who you are as a company. And so the role of the website is really to convey the simplicity of ultimately the problems that we're solving, and trying to plant the seed that we are a different way to solve the problem. But ultimately, it's the website. We're not an e-commerce site, right? So no one's going to come to Localist and say, I'm in. Where's the buy button? Where do I put in the credit card? It really does take a conversation to understand both what the prospect is trying to solve and then connecting what we do to that. And so the website is oriented around entirely just starting that conversation by planting a seed of, if not something compelling, then something provocative. I would love for us to get a call from someone to say, hey, you're going about this the wrong way. I'd really love to hear, how someone might counter what our thesis is.
Super interesting. It's actually quite an interesting conversion technique to be confrontative. Very good.
Right. We're not rude about it.
Very cool. Okay, what you brought up, actually, I have a sort of a question that's maybe a little bit of off tangent, but I think it's probably quite interesting for people to listen to. You mentioned that the market that you guys were in, obviously for a long time, has kind of exploded in the last 2 years. You mentioned, like, how does a company like yours, like, how do you guys react to that? You've been around for a long time. Is it a wave that you can surf? Like, how do you think about that?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It's there are a bunch of different emotions that come up. I would say one is excitement that finally this sort of way of thinking about the world and software being validated. There was this feeling of just being alone we were founded in 2009. Mm-hmm. And so until 2019, this notion of community event software, we were just going it alone. And so there's a lot of excitement around getting outside validation, objective validation of that concept. At the same time, there's also much more urgency because a lot of these other companies are getting venture backing. And for us, we're completely bootstrapped. Mm-hmm. And not that we're necessarily against venture funding at all. It's certainly one approach to take. But for us, it means that we really need to make sure we're nailing it. So these well-funded companies don't just steamroll us.
Yeah, super interesting. Very, very cool. I would love to maybe step back a little bit and ask you a bit more generic questions, especially how marketing, sort of about marketing a new product like yours, or a product that hasn't been on the in the spotlight, at least until recently.
Yeah, that's fair.
I would be curious, right? What do you think is the challenge when it comes to bringing innovation into marketing a product like yours?
That's a really good question. Let me think about that for a second. Mm-hmm. Can you ask that again? The challenge of innovation in marketing?
No, yeah, exactly. When you're marketing a product like yours, and now you have to be sort of innovative about what you do in terms of marketing, right? You have to do something that people hearing, listening, and planting the seed. You mentioned that previously. Mm-hmm. What did you find challenging over the last couple of years when trying to market the platform?
Sure. So we've been trying to market the platform essentially since day one, right? And so we've seen the waves of different channels coming and going. So when we were first getting started, the big innovation was your business needs to be on social. You need to be on Twitter, you need to be on Facebook, LinkedIn, and then it evolved to ebooks. So if you want to get the word out about what you're doing, create an ebook, put it behind a lead capture form, and success. Then it was webinars. So if you want to get ahead, do webinars about the topic that you're an expert in, get people to attend, and they will eventually convert to customers. Podcasts, that's another channel that we're seeing. All of that to say, I think marketing is innovation. And what I mean by that is, if you're using marketing to rise above competitors, or you're trying to create signal in a bunch of noise, I think the only answer I can say is do something that no one else is doing. So it isn't necessarily about, well, we're going to make a better ebook than everybody else. We're going to make a better podcast than everybody else. We're going to have a better Clubhouse session than everybody else. It's really more about what is cutting edge, what is new, where your audience is, and do you have a presence there? And it doesn't last long, but I'm not a marketer. My background is not in marketing. And I can say that the challenge is really just staying tapped into sort of the zeitgeist and really paying attention to what people or what your audience is gravitating towards that's new, and making sure you have a presence there. And that's the journey of marketing, is staying tapped into that pulse. And so ultimately it's there is no one innovation I can point to, or one piece of tech to adopt that will suddenly crack open marketing success. It really is the journey that is the destination, to bring up a cliche.
Yeah, very good. Cool. Since we're slowly coming to an end of the interview, I would love to jump into our rapid fire questions. Are you ready for those?
Sure.
Very good. There's no that much of another choice, really, though.
All right, I'm not ready, but we'll see. We'll see
Very
how it
good.
goes.
Very good. So what's the last book that you read?
Oh, Traction.
Yep.
It's a book, Gino Wickman, I think is his name. So he has this whole philosophy on how to run a company, essentially this thinking about a company like an operating system. And it's a really super interesting philosophy, and very digestible, I think, for either founders or operators in a company who are looking for ways to level up how they operate in a really consistent, accountable way.
Very cool. What's one single thing that your company is focused on the most at the moment?
Sure. Growth in what we call new markets. So as I mentioned, we're seeing the community industry really explode. And the industries that are the most interested in investing in community are B2Bs, associations, and nonprofits. And so we absolutely believe we have a lot of value to provide to those industries. And so we're focused on growing in those areas.
If there would be no boundaries in technology, what's the one thing you want to have fixed for your role today?
For my role, interesting. So one thing that we've been dreaming about is, I don't know. This can't be a fast answer, but it's the only answer I can think of. So through the pandemic, we went from in-person to exclusively virtual. And like I'm sure everyone has experienced, it can really burn you out when you're on Zoom all day, in a way that being in person, at least being present with other people in the room, doesn't burn you out. And we've also just seen sort of a lack of true connection. Like, I think there's a lot of interaction still on Zoom, but when we're talking about deep connection, meeting new people, that is has been diminished. And so from my perspective, I have a deep belief in in-person connection, but I do think that is absolutely going to change in the next 10 years when virtual reality, VR technology, gets to a point where it can trick your brain into thinking you're in person. And so I would say that being accelerated, VR technology being accelerated to a point where we're starting to see glimmers of that, would really be exciting in terms of just what we can change in our product strategy in order to meet that new technology. So we're not there yet, but we're right on the edge of that. So I'm really excited for when that day comes.
Very cool. And the last question, I've actually been burning to ask you that one, because you've been, on a long journey with Localist. If today would be the very first day, right? First day you're starting to work on Localist, right?
Yeah.
What is the one advice that you would give yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. It will always take longer than you think it will. So having the patience, I think. We've been around for 10 years. We've been bootstrapped and steadily growing year after year. And I think my ambitions for growth and having an impact on the world are always higher than where they are, which I think it can be healthy or unhealthy, right? And so I think keeping that patience in mind, I remember in the early days of Localist, like starting the company, I was just completely naive. I had this build it and they will come mentality. And of course, after a ton of scar tissue and learning that lesson over and over and over, I've gotten to the point where the muscle that it's built is patience. And I think that's what makes my role sustainable. And it's what makes a company sustainable, especially when it's growing organically and not artificially.
Very, very good. Myke, I really appreciate that you took the time with us today, shared the journey of Localist, the product as well. Like, we could be learning, how it supports communities in their events. And maybe just to wrap it up, I want to give you the very last word. If somebody would be forgetting all that we discussed about Locally today, what's the one thing that they should remember?
Yeah, I think really it's our thesis at Localist, which is without events, you don't have a community. So I would encourage any marketers or any companies in general to think about the events that are happening within their organization or adjacent to their organization that they might be involved in, that are just completely invisible to their audience. I think that's a huge untapped resource that you can very easily calculate an ROI for. So anyone who isn't doing that, I would encourage you to do that.
Thanks a lot for being a guest on Pathong Presents.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.